Great. So first things first, we are kind of assuming for this tutorial today that for most or not all of you, it's going to be your first time using Illustrator. We are assuming that you're not super familiar with it yet. So this is going to be quite a beginner Illustrator tutorial. Just like the other softwares on the Adobe Creative Suite, there is a bit of a learning curve. I remember my first time using Illustrator, like I could not for the life of me figure it out. And then eventually I did. And so it's really helpful to have a tutorial and then to also do some work yourself. Like I remember being on YouTube a lot watching tutorials. So we are going to I'm actually first going to talk a little bit about Illustrator versus other programs like Photoshop that you might be familiar with. So Adobe Illustrator is a vector-based program, which basically means it uses maths to create the shapes that you're working with. So all those lines, no matter how far you zoom in when you're on the program, it's crisp and clean. That's because it's using math to do that. And then if you're using Photoshop, you'll notice that eventually, like no matter how good the resolution is, the more you zoom in, the more you zoom in. It's working with raster-based images, which means that it's pixels. So if you zoom in, you're going to start seeing individual pixels. So Illustrator is really great for creating really crisp images and shapes. People like using it for logos, for posters, for any real graphics that need to be on large sizes or t-shirts or anything like that. It's just more reliable because the quality tends to be better. So I usually give this presentation to the third years when they do their professional practice class, and I do an InDesign tutorial. But I'm just going to show you a little bit about the ways that in this class and in this profession and in this program, we use the different Creative Suite softwares together to start creating products. So this is a project that I did some years ago, and we did the base plan. A lot of this was in AutoCAD and then put onto Illustrator. And from Illustrator, I could divide it up into the different sections that was the different sections of the master plan. So the built form, the groundwork, the existing landscapes, bridges, pedestrian walkways, natural groundwork, roads, rooftop connections. That's the kind of organization that we could do in Illustrator, and this is just the line work. And from there, and you will get to this eventually, today we're not really talking about it, but eventually you're going to be putting your master plans and your sections and work from Illustrator into Photoshop, because there you can do a lot more creative work with it. It's more for image manipulation than shape creation. So this is an example of that same line work that was imported into Photoshop and then edited and put together so that it looks visually more appealing. It has a consistent art style. And from there, you will use it this class. I'm certain. Adobe InDesign is the last software that we use quite a lot. And it's for taking all those things that we put together and creating documents for it. So your posters and your presentations or any booklets or reports, we prefer to use Adobe InDesign because it is just kind of the leading program for for document creation. And this is an example of all that work that I previously did put together on a spread where you have a legend, where you have call outs to different pictures, where you have text, etc. So let's jump into Illustrator. I feel like that should give you a good summary of how to use it in context with everything else. And then eventually when we do the Photoshop tutorial, maybe I'll come back to taking this project and putting it through Photoshop. So I've got Adobe Illustrator open. I believe I've got the most recent one on here, as should all of you. And so you'll notice that the first thing that comes up is that there are a number of presets. So those are are sizes and resolutions and stuff that are commonly used. So they give you the option of just clicking it instead of creating your own. I always kind of end up creating my own anyway, even though there's the 5.5 by 11, there's a 17 by 11 that we use. So in this square, it's pretty self-explanatory. I like to use inches as my unit of measurement when I'm setting up a page, just because I think, like most of you, I'm more familiar with page sizes in inches. And then, so I've got here my width 8.5 inches by 11 inches. You can choose your orientation, landscape or portrait. I'm sticking with portrait. I will say, like, and I've done it before, like if you're creating like a wallpaper as a personal project or a presentation or something, if you're creating something that you want to be the size of your screen, then you could use pixels to do that, because you know that your screen resolution is usually like 1920 by 1080. For the program, we're really just using inches, but that's something that could be useful for you in the future if you use this program for something else. So here you can also control your color space. So there are Illustrator uses 2 color spaces. The first one is the RGB color space. So that's red, green, and blue. It means it uses red, green, and blue as the base colors to create colors. And that is the color space that is used on screens. So if you're making something that's going to be looked at on a computer principally, or if it's going to be on a website or anything like that, RGB is good. That's what your computer is using. The next one is CMYK color space, which means it uses cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black, to mix colors. That's what your printers use. So if you're doing something that's going to be printed out as posters, as panels, as pamphlets, as whatever, you're going to want your color space to be in CMYK. So for this tutorial, doesn't really matter. I'm just going to leave it in CMYK because that's what it's in already. Now, they also have the option here for raster effects. I thought I would just talk about it because I did talk a little bit earlier when I was talking about Photoshop versus Illustrator, rasters and vectors. So you still have the possibility of importing images into your Illustrator files. Like you'll still put a JPEG or a PNG in there for trace. I will in this tutorial. And this option is for the resolution of those images that you put in. So it's not the images that you create using the vectors. It's the images that have already been created in other softwares and are now being viewed in Illustrator. So doesn't make much sense to change it. 300 pixels per inch is very good. So I'm not going to change it. I'm going to hit create. So I want to talk a little bit about interface because I know how scary it can be to be looking at your screen and there's a ton of options and a ton of windows and panels. And if you're not familiar with the tools yet and with everything, it can be really overwhelming. So I'm fortunate to be in a good position now with most of these softwares. I've figured it out. So a couple of things. So on the top bar, there's the window option. Here there's a couple of settings for your workspace. So if I hit like essentials, for example, you can see how it absolutely already cleans this up for me. I actually don't like it this way. I prefer essentials classic because I am used to the additional options that come up right under the top bar. I also like that the toolbar is not hiding from me in this case. So the second thing is there's a few windows that I recommend you have open. So same as here in window. Here you can select if you want your layers open, your properties open, your stroke. I do have a list of my favorite ones. Yes, properties, layers, stroke, your color can be open through here, along with character and paragraph. So it's also good that if you're working in your layers and you accidentally close it, there's no need to panic. You can just get that back by going Windows and then opening your layers, because it's happened to me and it's happened to my classmates in the past that they thought they've lost something that they're used to and it's just hiding in the Windows section. So that's a little bit about how to set up your page, how to set up your interface. I recommend you do some exploring for yourself, see what you like, see what you will get used to in time. What I'm going to do now is actually start doing some illustrating. So what I did it on my iPad, but it would be the same as if you drew it in your sketchbook or on a piece of trace paper if you're starting to do some concept work. I'm going to hit place, and I'm going to go ahead and import Lark 2020. Here we go. This sketch that I did. So it comes in too big. So I'm going to shrink it by holding down Shift on my keyboard. If I hold down Shift on my keyboard whilst I do this, it means it maintains the proportions of the image. If I wasn't holding down Shift, I would start skewing it. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you're moving and manipulating images in Illustrator. That principle applies to a few things like drawing different lines, etc. It looks like my shortcut for zooming in isn't working. Typically, that's Control or Command on your keyboard, and then the plus sign or the equal sign. So usually Command or Control plus the plus sign zooms in. Mine seems to be not working today, so I'm going to do this the manual way. Because I'm not going to troubleshoot it in the middle of the tutorial. So this is a sketch that I've put together. As you can see, it's not square. It's got kind of shoddy line work. But the concept's there. I've got notes on it. I kind of drew what I think the sections are going to look like. This is a stage in design that all of you will get to at some point and have gotten to in the past, but now you need to refine it. So I know that Afshin and Nadia have already talked to you about scale. Typically, scale would be done before this point. It can be done in Illustrator. It's just a lot of math. But this is more so focused on refining it and cleaning up the line work and creating line work. So I've got my layers open. So because I've imported an image that I'm going to use as my base, I'm going to go ahead and name it reference. And I'm going to lower the opacity, and I do that by clicking it here, clicking the little circle, going to properties, and then in opacity, I lower that opacity. So when I go back to layers, I'm going to lock it. So there's a box next to the eye. If you click it, that locks the layer. Means that this isn't going to move around as I trace it. I'm not accidentally going to draw in that layer when I don't mean to. And so layers is pretty self-explanatory. It has to do with the hierarchy of the shapes and information on your page and what goes on top of what. So if I have, this is my reference layer, it's at the bottom, it's going to be at the bottom all the time. Nothing is going to get under that unless I change the layer order. So next I might have trace for all the tracing work that I'm going to do. And I might have a layer called text for text that I'm going to add, or a layer called diagramming. And that's the order of it. So diagramming is always going to be on top of text unless I move it. Diagramming and trace are going to be on top of reference. That's how that works. And it's really great for organizing your Illustrator. If not, you will end up with thousands of little shapes without names, and it's going to look like a mess in your layers section, and you're going to be looking for something specific and you're not going to find it. So I really recommend really keeping an eye on the way that you label things and the way that you organize your groups. The sooner you start doing it, the sooner you get used to it, and it's only going to benefit you in the future. So I'm going on my trace. So a couple of things. So I can tell that I meant this to be a perfect square or rectangle. So I'm using my rectangle tool from the toolbar. I am drawing this. Now, a couple of things. So you can just eyeball it. You can see in the bottom corner as I hold it down, it actually says how wide and how high it is. That's great. It also means that if I open my properties, I can type in here, like if I wanted it to be exactly 4 inches by exactly, yeah, another 4 inches. I can do that there. I can change the sizes here if you know exactly how big. Alternatively, you can eyeball it. One other thing is like, just like when I was showing you how to reshape, to resize an image, you can hold down shift when you're drawing a rectangle and it will keep it like perfectly square. So that's super helpful. So I'll come back to this a little bit in the future, but you see that now that I've done this, there's a big white box on top of my work. I can't see under it. That's not useful for anyone. So that is relating to the fill of the object. So when I talk about the fill of the object, it's common terminology is used in PowerPoint and in Photoshop and Illustrator, etc. It's just what makes up the inside of a shape. So the pattern, a solid color, a gradient, a picture, that's the fill. So right now you can see in this bottom left-ish corner, there's a white square and a black box with a hole in the middle of it. That references the fill color and the outline color. So right now we can see that I've got a white fill and a black outline. I can get rid of the fill by clicking it, so it's now on top, and then hitting this none button. There we go. So now all of a sudden it's just an outline. It does not have a fill. We could change this later if we wanted to, but this is better for tracing. Same with like, if you wanted it to have a fill but not an outline, you can hit these arrows and now it's got a black fill but no outline. That doesn't help us, but it could in the future for something else. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing some tracing. So I'm actually going to click this object. We can see that this little red mark shows up in the layers box because that's showing that that object belongs to that layers. So I'm going to click it and I'm going to name it site boundary because that's my site boundary. And then I'm going to go ahead and trace my next thing. So this next tool that's really useful is the pen tool. It's like the #1 tool you're going to be using on Illustrator. So the pen tool just allows you to draw line segments, whether it's one or multiple. So it just lets you put down those points and then it fills in the lines for you. So I have a boardwalk here that I intended to draw. So one thing is if I hold down shift again, that line that's an angle will now be, oh, sorry, I was not holding down shift, will be straight. So that's great. Sometimes if you're trying to draw like perfectly parallel lines, for this, I don't need it to be. So I'm going to continue this way, and same if I hold down shift, it's going to draw the lines right across. So I'm actually going to use it in this part because I think it cleans up my drawing a little bit. Indeed it does. And then here again, I'm going to not use shift anymore, and I'm going to finish my boardwalk. And just like I named the site boundaries, I'm naming this boardwalk. I can't stress this enough that this is not a real site. This is something that I made up just for the purpose of this. But I'm hoping that the principles that I'm used can be used. Generally, they should be able to be used in any work that you're doing. So next is going to be all of these trees. So I'm actually going to show you a couple different ways to draw trees. So you probably saw some different conventions for drawing trees last semester, or if you took tech or anything in high school. So the first thing is that a tree is not ever just a circle. You've got to be putting down where the trunk is. So I'm going to do just that. It's in the middle of that circle. I'm using what I showed you earlier about the fill in the outline to rotate it. So now it's a solid fill in the middle. That could be a tree. It's not the best tree, but it's a tree. And then you could do little things like add this little cutout. It's quite common. Or let's say you've got a bunch of different styles of trees and you've got different conventions. This is one way to do it. Alternatively, you can use your paintbrush tool, which is like drawing like on MS Paint. And that like is a tree. I don't want it. But those are some different ways that you can do it. Actually, I'm going to put that one back for now. I hit Control Z just to show you that there are some options when it comes to line styles. And specifically for trees, I've used this before. Here at the top, if you've got Essential Classics for your workspace, under the kind of brush, if you put down this style, it kind of creates a sketched edge, which is actually sometimes a fun effect for trees, or for anything that you think should have a sketched edge. I've done a couple illustrations in the past that I've used that just so that it looks more like hand rendered. So there are some options there. I'm going to go ahead and use this one. So I'm going to right click it. I'm going to select all of it, right click it, and then hit group so that when I move it around, it's moving the entire thing and not just components of it. And I'm going to start placing trees on my own plan. I'm going to try and do this speedy because I know it's not fun to watch someone fill up a plan with trees, but it is important. And the way I'm doing it is I'm hitting Control C or Command C if you've got a Mac, and then Command or Control V, it pastes it. So it's a lot faster than right clicking all the time. And I can also pick a few. So let's say I make this smaller and I see V. I can now copy and paste multiples by holding down Shift. And we're almost done. There we go. So now all of these are looking kind of in the same direction. They all kind of look like Pac-Man and they're facing the same way. So one thing to do for some variation is to click it. So a square box comes around it. And if you go to the corner, you can rotate that. And you can actually, if you go in and do that for everything, then all of a sudden it looks like there's some more variation and it's a little bit less weird to look at. So I'm going to go ahead. Now I've done that. So here in my layers, we can see how each of those groups show up. And we can see how you get a little image for each of those shapes. So that's actually really great if you're looking for something. So I am going to click. Now I'm going to click. If you click it and it turns blue, like this blue bar, it means that you can kind of move it around in your layer order, but it doesn't select the shape or the path on the drawing. So if you want to do that from your layers, you've got to click the little circle. So now if I click the little circle, you can see how it selects itself on my drawing. So if I want to group these, I'm clicking it, I'm holding down Shift. Now all of them are selected. Right click, group, trees. So now I can turn this group on and off, and that's my tree layer. So that's great. It also means that when I'm applying a color or something to those trees later, I can do it all at once. And if you were to do it individually, you just expand the group and you click them individually. I'm hoping that that is making sense. So the next thing that I have here is a rock wall. I'm a little annoyed that my shortcut's not working to zoom in. But I'm taking my pen tool. You could do all of these individually. In the interest of time, I'm going to do them all as one big group. Remember, I am showing you the tools, but when you do this project yourself and projects in the future, it's up to you to take your time to make sure that you're spending enough time and enough attention on each of these individual aspects to make it look really good. These are just the foundations. And this is Foundation Studio, actually, so that's really fitting. So there's my rock wall. I'm going to go ahead and name it rock wall. And then you'll see what I have drawn here as well is like contour lines. So I don't know how much you know about contour lines yet. You will very soon. It's just the topography, it's the shape of the landscape. So for me, it was relevant because I knew that I was trying to put together a little sketch that had a range of elevations for when I do the section. So when you're base mapping, sometimes it's really useful to have your topography on there so that you can read more or less the shape of the landscape. And some people like to have it in a different color or a different opacity or something like that, just so that it's kind of like it's like there, it's important, but it's not as important as some of the other physical elements. So as you can tell, they're all curved lines. So until now, with the exception of the circles, and that was the circle shape, I haven't shown you how to draw curved lines yet. There are two ways to do this that I use. The first one is using your curvature tool. So sometimes it does this, sometimes it doesn't, that if you click on a line that already exists with your curvature tool, it like creates a curved point to it. So if I just wanted to trace this, sometimes I've got to trace past the other line. It creates all these points of manipulation. And then this is kind of annoying, but if you don't want it to like exceed your boundary box, I would recommend there's a selection tool and there's a direct selection tool. So the selection tool is this arrow that's got kind of the black fill, and then or perhaps it's hollow. And then the direct selection tool has a white fill. So it means that once you click on it, you can individually manipulate all the points on a curve. Same thing as if this wasn't a curve. You can individually manipulate all the points on it if you use the direct selection tool. This is super helpful for creating unique shapes and for fixing things like this where I don't want it to leave the boundary box. I'm just going to tuck it back in. And then these arrows, not arrows, these lines here kind of help you manipulate the direction of the curves. So another way to do this that I like more, actually, I think it's faster, is to use your pen tool as intended and draw one at the beginning. And you know what, this isn't the best spot. There we go. Draw one at the beginning and end of your curved line. And then using your curvature tool, create those points. And so it also means that if you are going to trace something pretty quickly, you can kind of trace that whole thing using your pen tool, and then using the curvature tool, just like curve the lines that are meant to be curved. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of these pretty quickly because the site is not real. I'm not doing an exact trace. You would do differently if this was a project for you. And using my curvature tool, I'm just creating these lines. And then I can go ahead and, yep, that feels right. I can go ahead and see all these paths that I've created, select all of them, group them, and that becomes my topography, or I'm just going to keep it topo. And I'm actually going to take topography and I'm going to move it just to the layer above site boundary. So there is how to trace, if I hide my reference layer, just the line work of a plan that you've put together on Illustrator. Now, a couple of things. So let's say now I've got this line work together, but all of it looks too thick. I can select it, and then using at the top, or using the stroke here, I'm going to go ahead and do window, stroke is already open here. You can change the weight of it here. So I can say I want everything to be 0.5, and now everything is skinnier. Let's say I wanted the boardwalk to be thicker. I can click just the boardwalk, and using the stroke section, I can make that one thicker. If I wanted the topography to be much lighter than everything else, but my boundary to be thicker, you can kind of see how you can start now playing with individual parts of the line work. That's really useful. So what I always do, this is just a trace, this is just the line work. But now you're going to want to start filling it in. So it depends on the project that you're doing. You could want to fill it in on Illustrator. Sometimes what I do is I put down all the base colors on Illustrator so that when I put it in Photoshop to manipulate it later, it's really easy for me to divide up all the sections. You can do an entire base plan in Illustrator, and I have done that before as well. So I am going to actually show you this section first, and then I'm going to show you about how filling things in work. So you should be familiar with sections. I know that you do it in first year in the studio that you just had with Martin. And so I've taught that class. I know you've not taught, I've TA'd that class. I know you do sections and you should understand it relatively well. This might be the first time that you do it on Illustrator. So I'm just going to show you a couple of hints or tips. So as you can see in my little sketch, I kind of drew already what my section might look like. I figured out where my section line was, and I said, this is what this might look like. So a couple of things is I have it on a side, so I'm going to rotate it and then I'm going to do it. So I'm going to duplicate this layer here. I'm going to select it. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to create a new layer called section ref. You don't like, there's probably easier ways to do it, but this is what I'm doing. I'm going to paste that same thing here. I'm going to hide the other layer. I'm going to hide the trace that I just did. And then using my rotate, I'm going to rotate it just so that section sketch is now facing the right direction. I'm also going to change the opacity of it because I don't need it to be that thick. Let's make it like a 50% opacity. And you can see how it lines up with our base plan, which I'm also going to rotate just for the interest of consistency. You didn't have to rotate it. I just think that it does, like you could have drawn it all on its side. I think that's kind of messy though, and then do it. So now I've got this the way I want it. I know where my section line should be, so I'm just making sure I'm on the right section. So I'm going to label this one section. I'm going to draw my section line. So I'm going to hold down Shift. So we are recording this so that you can watch it back later. If at any point you have a question or maybe questions at the end, I'll answer those. Or if I'm going too fast and you think you won't even be able to rewatch it, let me know and I can slow down a bit. So I'm holding down Shift to keep that section line straight. That's my section line. I'm actually just going to scoot it. Yep, no, it's exactly where I want it. So what I find to be helpful is if I take my little brush and let me put this back on point round, and I draw little ticks where there's something that intersects with my section line. So this is where the boundary intersects with my section line. This is where boardwalk does, where the other end of the boardwalk does, the beginning and end of the rock wall, the beginning of the tree canopy, the trunk, the end of the tree canopy, the beginning of the next tree canopy, the trunk, the end of the next tree canopy, and the end of the boundary line. So I have got that all under section. If I click section, I can copy and paste that, or you can just move it, and I can move it directly off. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to move this just above, and you can see that it's pretty accurate to what I drew the first time around. And it's just to keep in mind where things go on. So I know from the site that I made up that my topography starts way up high and that it lowers. So you could just draw a line, and then using your curvature tool, go in there and manipulate it. Unless you know it's a perfectly straight line, you'll know your site when you get to do this work. There we go. That's me manipulating the individual points. So then I also know that this is sorry, I actually want so we know that this is where my boardwalk ends, and this is where my boardwalk starts. I know that it's a little lookout, looking out over the over a wetland. That's what I imagined for this. So I can draw that line and line that up along with my terrain. I'm going to extend it downwards. I know that there's going to have to be a rail. That rail is going to be pictured in my section, so I'm going to draw the rail's edge. For the purpose of this, I know that the rock wall starts here and it ends here. And according to the section line, I know that there's a tree canopy, there's a tree trunk here, and there's a tree trunk here. And that the canopy extends. Sorry, I actually drew that one in the wrong spot. This one should be over here. And that the canopy extends to these extents. So this is a mistake, and so I want to teach you all to look out for it. So you can see that some of these things that I just drew are actually lighter than the rest. And I'm realizing that that's because I accidentally drew them under section ref. And I've got that layer with the lowered opacity because it's a reference. So if I want to move these because I realize that they're in the wrong spot, I go in here, I select it so that the band turns blue. I just pick them up and I drop them under section, and there we go. The opacity has returned. I also know that I'm going to have a water line, so I'm going to draw it just along here. And that is a very basic section. And it's true to my site because that's what I've put together for it. So a couple of things. A lot of section lines are thicker than others. So if I want to go thicken this this line, I click it and I can go under stroke and improve it. Now, this, I want you to notice this, is that because I drew that line for the water and I connected it to the bottom, the section line, Illustrator went ahead and it joined those two lines, even though I didn't mean them to. So now when I increase the stroke size for my section line, it does the same for the water line, which I don't want. So I can go ahead and change that by, I'm going to hit Control Z so that it goes back to normal. I'm going to click that line and then I'm going to use my scissor tool. So it's under the paintbrush tool. Sometimes it looks like the eraser or the knife. So make sure you click scissors. And then I'm going to go ahead and click that one point where I want to separate it. So now I've divided that one line into two lines. And now when I change the stroke width of the section line, it has no effect on the water because that's separate. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the section ref. I don't need it anymore. And now we're left with the section and the boardwalk. So I am going to, this is something that I do because I'm a little bit worried about making changes to my work and then hating it and wishing I still had the old stuff. So I like to make duplicates of my layers. So I'm going to actually copy this image trace that we just made. And I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to call it base. You can call it anything else. And I'm going to paste it just directly on top. So I know that if I hate what I do to this, I can just delete it and I will still have the progress from what I did previously. And I'm going to do the same to my section. You have the possibility of not doing this, but I do it on Photoshop. I do it on Illustrator. It's just kind of like a bit of a fallback protection. So now we've got just the trace and you want to fill them in. So just like how we got rid of the fill the first time, now you can import it. So I'm going to show you a little bit about creating color palettes. I usually like the Adobe Color Wheel. I was having some issues with it recently, so I'm going to show you, sorry, I have about 1 billion tabs open. There we go. So I'm going to show you a website called Colors that is spelled like the American spelling of colors, except cool. So like coolers. So if I hit start generator, it's really friendly. It's fun to use. It comes up with a few randomly generated colors for me. If I hit my space bar on my computer, it alternates them. So let's say I'm doing this and I'm really into this color June bud. I can go ahead and lock it in. I can hit space again, and then it changes everything except for the ones that I lock in. So this is actually a really neat way of creating a color palette if you are creating a document or something like that. Then you've got it just this way. So for the future, I'm going to screenshot this. You could save it. You could save it here, but I just used my light shot extension for Chrome to do it. And then I'm going to paste it, but it also lets you do take colors from images that already exist. So I'm opening it up again. And then I say, let's say I looked for a boardwalk color. I did this earlier. I really like this one. And I said, I want my color palette to mimic that of an actual one. I can go ahead and import that image, browser drop. There it is. Now, a couple things happened, at least it happened to me when I did a run through of this, is that I didn't love all the colors that it chose. So I thought that there needed to be a blue and there needed to be a brown, etc. So you can actually look at this and you can drag individual ones to find the color pixel that you want it to reference. So actually that's kind of an ugly blue. That's a little bit better. And then I want this brown to be one of the brighter browns on the boardwalk. That's something that you can do using this software or this website. So there we go. Next, open in generator. You can hit export, and you can export it as a PNG. I just keep using screenshot because it keeps being easier for me. So there we have a bit of a color palette. There's a few different ways to do that. You can use different apps, etc. You can create one yourself on Illustrator, but I just find that this is helpful to have on you. So I want to fill in this boardwalk. I'm going to use the eyedropper tool. So the eyedropper, just like other programs, it takes the properties of the selected image and applies it to a new one. So I've selected my boardwalk. I want it to be that shade of brown. I click that shade of brown and it immediately fills it in. So it filled it in without an outline. I can go ahead and add that by clicking the outline, by clicking the fill, by clicking the fill again, and then choosing an outline for it. Or alternatively, you could have not had an outline and then just use that trace layer that I never deleted and have that appear on top of it. Sorry, it's being a little finicky. But it does work. There we go. Or you can just have that appear on top of it. That's something that you have the option to do. So I would go ahead and see all of my trees are grouped, which means when I click one tree, I select all of them and I can go ahead and fill that in. It means that when I select my rock color, I should have had a gray in here. I'm just going to use the light brown. And then if I select my boundary box, I can go ahead and select that light green. So a couple of things, like you can decide that you want your topography to be a white color, which we've done before, and I do like how it looks, and up the stroke of it. And there's your topography. A couple of things, like I do want my trees to have outlines because we have the inside of the tree trunk. So if I select it, it selects all of them. If I double click on one, then you can select that one without everything else in the group. That's something to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and click it. I'm going to click outline. I do want it to have an outline. I'm applying it. I was applying it. Okay, there we go. Now a couple of things. So I know that this is in my head a wetland, so I'm going to want there to be a shoreline. I can't just click one of the lines, one of the lines of the topography, the contour lines. And I can't just turn it I can't just do a fill of blue because watch what happens. I'm actually going to, for the sake of this, copy one and paste it separately. Sorry. Copy. Paste. So it's separate on top. Because I know it's going to be part of my water line. So I can't just fill it in with blue, because what it does is, because it's not complete, like the ends of the line aren't touching each other, it doesn't know what the fill should be. So it like creates a line. And so we know what we want it to look like, but it fills it in like this. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a blue, or I could eyedrop this blue. And then what I am going to do is I'm going to take my pen tool, and I know that if I click a line, it adds to it. So there I am filling in that section. I'm creating a water line. It's now a complete fill. So a couple of things, outline, no outline, that's up to you. A couple of things is that this is now with the eyedropper tool, a really easy way to fill in your sections. So the same thing with this section, when I had drawn the line, I didn't finish it. So if I bring that down now, it fills in the rest of the shape. I can click on the trees and eyedrop the trees so that the same shapes, the same colors get applied to the trees, etc. There are a couple of options when it comes to patterns that you can apply. So it's really easy to go overboard with them, so I would say be careful. But let's say I wanted this boardwalk to have a boardwalk texture. I'm just going to copy and paste it and put it back right exactly where I got it. So if I go in the properties panel under fill, if I double click it, oh, here it is. If I double click it, you can select here. I actually want you to see it show up. Strange. There we go. Single click, that was the answer. Swatch libraries menu, and you can hit, they've got a ton of different fills that you can be using. So if you go under patterns, for example, and decorative, basic graphics, nature, etc., I can do basic graphics and do textures, then it opens this whole window for me. I know that there is one in here that looks like a boardwalk, so I'm just going to click until I find it. You can see here at the bottom, because it's not showing up, it's because it's applying it to the outline rather than the fill. So I'm rotating it. I'm getting rid of the outline. And now I can go ahead and look for all these different patterns. There we go. I believe that this is the dash line pattern that looks like the boardwalk, or perhaps I want this or this diagonal one. So that's an option that you have. And then you can still have the outline as being solid black. There we go. So that's kind of fun, different ways that you can play around with shape fills. Another thing that is kind of important is, so the color palette that I created is nice, but it's kind of dark. Usually lighter ones, depending on the project, are more effective. So now imagine I did this and I hated the colors that I put together. I can go ahead and you're like, you don't want to go in and individually change the green of each green shape to a different one. I can go ahead and select all of them. And then here at the top of my Essentials Classic toolbar, there is this color wheel or recolor artwork. If I click that, they've got some generated themes. If I hit advanced options, I can actually change the current to new color of all of these colors. So I want this blue to all of these blues to actually be a much lighter blue. It'll do it for me. And all of these greens to actually be a partially lighter green. I can go ahead and do that. Same with this brown. And then earlier you heard me complain that I had not created a gray. I can go ahead and add the gray. So that's a really easy way to recolor your artwork all at once. So this is more or less how to start creating and refining your work in Illustrator. There are some more tools for diagramming that I want to get into, but do we feel like taking like a 5-minute break?
Yeah, Cara, this is fantastic. Thank you. Let's take a quick break.
I'm back on screen share. So and Illustrator, it's also really useful to be diagramming on it. And so there's a lot of different lines that you can be creating. So I talked to you a little bit about using the stroke window to change the width of a stroke. But there's also some additional things you can do with it. So I'm going to hide this layer that I've made. I don't need it right now. I'm going to make a new layer called diagram. Oh, actually, I already have a layer called diagramming I forgot about. So I'm going to create a few lines for us. Holding down Shift, I'm copying and pasting. Just so that we've got something to start working off of. Great. So a couple of things that are useful when you're diagramming is arrows and leader lines. So if I click this and I go into my stroke window here, you can select arrowheads. So there's a multitude of arrowheads. So you can pick which side it applies to, if it applies to both or neither, or if one side's going to get an arrow and one side's going to get like a little ball. You can also change the size of those points. So right now the scale is at 100. This links them. So the arrow, this means that if I increase the size of one, it increases the size of the other. But if I wanted just the arrow to be big and not the ball, I would unlink it. And then I can do it separately and then they don't go together. So another thing to be doing with your stroke, so you can change the width. And you can also introduce dashed lines. So right now it's got a 4-point dash, but I could make it a 12-point dash. I could do a 12-point dash with a 3-point space. And then I wonder if I introduce a fifth thing, then it creates a new pattern. So that's a couple of ways to be creating different dashed lines. Additionally, let's increase this. There are zigzag options. So I can go ahead and under Effect, Distort and Transform, I can use zigzag to now create something like this. So I like to use it when I'm talking about how much noise or even like a buffer or something is on a site. Then you can change the size here. Make sure that preview is selected so you can see what you're doing as you're doing it. You can choose the amount of ridges per section, which is kind of insane, and whether you want it to be smooth or cornered. So that just kind of depends on the kind of work that you're doing. Let's say I do this again. So I just copied and pasted it. That looks kind of cool. And I select it under properties. You can see that it's got an effect applied to it, which is zigzag. So if I click zigzag from properties, I can alter what I've got here. So now I can smooth the ends and I can have less ridges per segment. I can also manipulate the kind of line. So instead of like just how I showed you earlier, you can add this sketchy line. You can also have, that's ugly. You can also have lines that are not the same width throughout. So right now it's uniform width, but you could have it like this where it tapers off at the ends, or like this where it changes the width through the middle, or like this that it kind of becomes a point. So you can kind of imagine now when you're diagramming and you're talking about where noise comes from, or where there's a buffer, or where people tend to hang out. So people also talk, oh, actually there's an additional one. I don't know how you're going to use this one, but I'm sure you're all very creative. There's also something called the twist. And I've got it at 400%, it does this. At lower, you can see how it is manipulating this shape, this twist. I can also, once I've done that, increase the weight of it. I can make it a dashed line with any kind of interesting shape or interesting pattern that I want. I can go ahead and add arrows to it. So it's actually quite useful when you're diagramming. Something else to consider is gradients. So let's say I draw a rectangle. If I open my gradient window, so I'm going to go window, gradient. It opens this for me. It's in black and white, not ideal. So I'm going to go ahead and click this. So this is where you manipulate the individual colors. So I'm clicking the white. I'm making sure that I put this under CMYK, because under the grayscale, it's just gray. That's not helping anyone. But I can say that there's going to be a yellow end, And then under this one, let's put this under CMYK. I'm going to say there's going to be a purple end. No, actually that's ugly. A red end. And you can see that I've accidentally applied it to the outline, not the fill. This could be useful for you. For me, it's not, so I'm switching that. So that's one way that you can say, like, if you're talking about heat or concentration of people, so you can say there's least amount of people in the yellow zones. You can draw a circle and then just have it be that yellow. Or you can say most amount of people tend to congregate here. And then you can do the same thing and have it be that color of red. And then have a different zone on your map that says here. So if this was on our map, base here, let's move this stuff out of the way. You can say we kind of imagine all the people to be congregating here and walking through here. So then you can draw a new, let's take this. You can either lower the opacity so that you can see, let's do like a 50%. So it becomes like a zone. I don't know why that disappeared on me, but there we go. And then you can say that the pedestrian flow is supposed to go through here. So you can say that people move from here. Let's make this a curvature tool all the way through the boardwalk. And then because they move in both directions, you can apply an arrow to both ends of it. So I would switch this here so it's an outline and not a fill. I would improve the stroke. I would change the color perhaps because this one's not super visible. So maybe let's make this a yellow. And then I would say, let's have window stroke. Let's have arrows going both sides because people move on both sides. And let's do dashed line. So there's a little example of kind of movement through sight and how something would be congregating in one area. And then the trees could be a noise buffer. If we're imagining a road on the other side, there's a lot of noise, for example. So there are a lot of different ways that you can be manipulating lines on here. So I'm actually just going to talk a little bit about text because you can use text on like Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. You can apply text to everything. I tend to favor doing my diagramming and stuff in Illustrator and then doing my text in InDesign for most of the time, but not always. But let's say I'm going to label this. So let's say I want to label this lookout. Let's make this black. I could say that I want it to have a tiny little arrow and a tiny little ball at the end to signify the end of my leader line. And then if I want to include text here, I can move this to the front by going under diagramming and then lifting it. Or I could also right click the shape and then arrange, bring to front, now puts that at the front of that layer. So if I had my own thing called text, I'm actually going to move this arrow to the text. Then I can go ahead and using the text tool, draw it here and say, board walk, look out against wetland. So there are a few things that you can do. So if I wanted to change the shape of the square, it's pretty easy. It's a text box. You do it this way. But let's say I wanted to change the font, etc. Then I'm going to go under my window, under type, under character. I'm going to make sure that character is open. I think I accidentally just closed it. Here it is. I also want paragraph to be open. So that changes on paragraph. You can edit the alignment. So whether you want it to be aligned to the left, center, or right. Under character, I can change the size of it. Note how this is going to be something that happens on InDesign. If I make it really big, you can see that it's like creating these hyphens here. If I want to get rid of that, I'm going to go under paragraph and unclick hyphenate. And I would recommend you do that because I think the hyphens are ugly and usually unnecessary. It's best to just give everything its own line and have it connected. So that's kind of how we manipulate the text, and you would change the font here under this section. So I can change it to like Avenir. It's one that I'm pretty familiar with. And then from the same character section, this is where you would control the size. This is where you would control the width of the text. See how they're beginning to space out a little bit more, or the space between the lines. So if you want it to be a 2-point or whatever, there we go. And then here, if you would do the bold and the italic. So for Avenir, the options are book, regular, and black. So I'm actually just going to keep it as book because I think it looks the best. But that's kind of how you would be diagramming and labeling on your Illustrator files. Nadia, let me know if there are more points that you would like me to tackle on. So if I wanted to export this, so right now it's kind of wild looking. So let me move these shapes that I don't need to the side. I'm going to choose what I want visible and what I don't want visible. So let's say I want all of this visible. There we go. I don't need this. For whatever reason, I do want this. So a couple of things. So if I go ahead and hit file save, this saves as as an Illustrator file. So I'm going to go ahead and save this on my computer and under Lark 2020 example. So let's save this an AI file, which means that it opens in Illustrator. It's also not like the easiest one to send to one another. So I could also save this as an SVG. So an SVG is I forget what it stands for, but it's like for vectors. So if you just want to save the vector, an SVG file is the way to do that. Same with like an EPS. Like I designed some shirts when I was on LAS, and I had to send them off as an EPS format to the printers because that's the only file that they used. If I wanted to export this one, I would go File, Export, and then I could export as all of these options. So a PNG, a JPEG, a Photoshop file, a TIFF that I have never had to use before, or as a PDF. Should be here, but it's not. Cancel file, save as. Yes, so on Illustrator, you don't export it as a PDF, you save as a PDF. And you export as images. That's different on the other softwares where when you hit export, you can export as a PDF. So if I save this as a PDF example, save, it's kind of useful this way for file saving and for working with groups, because if you save PDF, if you save a PDF from an Illustrator file, it maintains those layers. So then when I send it to a friend, like just a PDF to a friend, they can open that PDF on their computer and have all those layers and names organized, maintained, which is really great. That doesn't happen if you save it as like a PNG or something like that, which essentially flattens the image. So, and then file, this is me exploring actually. So file, save as PDF. Oh, this is actually helpful. So let's say I have created a JPEG or a PNG that I want to save. So on Illustrator, there's no backgrounds. So right now, if I were to save this as a JPEG or as a PNG, so this is just useful to know in the future. Sorry, export as PNG. A couple of things are going to happen. So if I do it as is, example PNG, it saves everything that's not like even though I moved all that stuff off to the side, you can see here, I moved all that stuff to the side. It's still counting that as something as I drew. So it's not sticking to the artboard. And it's also transparent. It doesn't have a background. So if I wanted it to have a background, I could do white or black here, or leave it as transparent. Sometimes you want to leave it as transparent. Like if you're creating graphics for a document or anything like that, that's great. The thing though is like I moved all these shapes off to the edge because I didn't want them to be exported. So if I'm file export as PNG and I hit use artboards, then when I export it, let's see, I'm just waiting for this to load. Now it's sticking to just what's within the artboard. So when you're working in Illustrator, it's really easy to have a bunch of like items that you don't necessarily want, and then it's a pain to crop later. So exporting it with the artboards is one way to make sure that just what you want to export is being exported and not all the garbage that you have on the side. Alternatively, you could delete that, but if you're working on a file that you're constantly changing or etc., then it's not really ideal to be deleting things all the time. I like to I'm kind of a maximalist. I would rather have more and then crop things later. So that's one way to do this. And then you can, of course, import a variety of files. So I can hit File, Place. And I don't know if I have enough here, so all formats. So I've got an Illustrator file, a PDF file, I've got JPEGs, a PNGs. You can open from AutoCAD, though I'm not sure. I usually, if I'm on AutoCAD, will do it on AutoCAD, we'll scale it on AutoCAD, and then I'll export it as a PDF. So I'm importing as a PDF. I believe you can save it as a DWG and then open the DWG, but I usually save it as a PDF and then import it as a PDF. Nadia, I don't know if you have more thoughts about that specifically. That's kind of what I do.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Bringing it in as a PDF is a good idea. You can bring it in as a DWG, but people tend to bring it as a PDF because it's just more intact with the layers and all. So that's totally fine. And just another quick point too that Cara's mentioned too, when you save your work as an Illustrator file, that's great. We actually have the program, Illustrator program, so we could open up the files. But if you're giving it to other colleagues or, for example, to another person in a government office, if this is a project that you're working on, they would typically get PDF files because that's like a program that everybody could open up and use. So like how Cara said, if she wants to send it to a friend will typically have a PDF format or software, but not an Illustrator Adobe software. So that's why we always ask people to save things as a PDF copy because it's universal and it still keeps that kind of vector base intact.